The Subcommittee on the Environment will now come to order. Before I do my opening statement, I want to my last chance to be in the chair. I want to thank the loyal opposition and the minority. I think that the subcommittee has had a pretty good record of moving some very contentious pieces of legislation, and from TSCA to the Safe Drinking Water Act to Brownsfield to the nuclear waste reauthorization language that passed 340-72. In all honesty, couldn't do it without your help. And so I want to publicly say that and thank you. And now I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. Given the large number of witnesses and in an interest of maximizing time for questions and discussions, I will keep my opening as brief as possible and welcome others to do the same. Over the last 2 years, many of you have heard me say transportation fuel legislation was one of my reach goals for this Congress. To that end, interested members participated in 3 stakeholder roundtables to get this conversation started, and the Environment Subcommittee held 5 hearings to further explore the future of transportation fuels. I want to thank Chairman Walden for not just allowing but encouraging this effort. I also want to thank the witnesses before us today who actively engaged in those roundtables and hearings, and I especially want to thank Congressman Flores, who co-authored the resulting discussion draft with me. Rather than looking at individual federal transportation fuel policies on their own, the draft 21st Century Transportation Fuels Act takes a wider view of those policies and considers how they might work together to bring more value to consumers and more certainty to stakeholders. The draft would transition from blend-specific mandates to performance-based standards for future fuels and vehicles, remove long-standing barriers to the availability and usability of higher ethanol blends, provide an additional decade of certainty for advanced biofuels, and harmonize EPA and DOT vehicle efficiency programs. The need for this type of comprehensive reform is timely. Stakeholders on all sides of this debate have been whipsawed by months, by rumors and actual administration actions, and that uncertainty will only increase after 2022 when EPA receives even broader discretion to set biofuel blending requirements. In fact, given EIA projections of declining liquid transportation fuel demand, it's difficult to envision a post-2022 scenario in which biofuel volumes would not actually be lower than they are today. I look forward to a constructive dialogue about what the future holds, as well as what the discussion draft would mean for various stakeholders. And with that, I yield my remainder of my time to Mr. Flores.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you calling this hearing on today's discussion draft. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to one of the folks who grew up in the same little town I did up in Texas Panhandle, Mr. Wesley Spurlock. Great to have you here as a witness. Since the RFS was first established in 2005 and expanded in 2007, much has changed in the market for transportation fuels. If federal policies are not routinely evaluated and updated to reflect market conditions, consumers end up having less than optimal choices. Let me give you a few examples of the concerns that have been raised before this committee about the current status quo of American fuels policy. Number one, biofuels producers raise concerns on the annual implementation of the RFS and other regulatory barriers to the market. 2, refiners face increasing costs in complying with the RFS. 3, automakers face challenges in complying with efficiency programs under 2 different agencies inside the EPA and the DOT. As Chairman Shimkus, the number 4, some environmental communities believe that the current generation ethanol, or Gen 1 ethanol, creates environmental problems. As Chairman Shimkus stated, the 21st Century Transportation Fuel Act discussion draft takes a larger view of federal transportation fuel policies. This draft incorporates into legislative text many of the ideas from 3 bipartisan roundtables and 5 subcommittee hearings. For consumers, higher octane fuels can bring increased economy and performance for the next generation of engines. For stakeholders, transitioning the RFS to a national octane standards creates a new market opportunity for biofuels producers and gives compliance certainty to refiners and automakers. And before the panel starts, I have a few reflections on the testimony that I read today. One is we have to put the consumers and the environment first, not our self-interest. Number 2, the choice is clear. We can either go with the status quo, which almost everybody has said is broken, or we can have a compromise solution, because I can guarantee you there's not going to be a perfect solution that's going to make each of you 100% happy. These organizations spent valuable time giving feedback on this, and that constructive feedback was appreciated. Some organizations spent their time bashing other stakeholders. That was not productive. And so the thing I would ask you is to stay engaged and remember that we don't all get 100% of what we want. We're trying to come up with an optimum solution for the consumers, the environment. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Shimkus. And Mr. Chair, I do want to thank you for your leadership of the subcommittee and your cooperative spirit that has moved us along in the right direction. I agree with your assessment. We've been productive and very successful as a subcommittee. And I thank our witnesses, not just for joining us this morning, but also for our input, your input in this process over the course of the 115th Congress. Before we go any further, I do want to recognize Chair Shimkus and Mr. Flores for all the work that went into producing this discussion draft. For the past 2 years, the subcommittee has hosted 3 stakeholder roundtables and 5 hearings on transportation fuels policy. As we heard at previous hearings, this is a complicated problem with no easy solution, so I appreciate the effort that went into developing the proposal. These members were given an incredibly difficult assignment, trying to find common ground on an issue where many stakeholders say it does not exist. And while I have some serious concerns with the draft as it is currently written, I do think that the chair and Mr. Flores have done an admirable job and conducted a process in good faith to try to create that common ground. For the past 2 years, we have heard about issues with the implementation of the Renewable Fuel Standard Program, which has existed under administrations from both parties. In my mind, the program can certainly be improved. We will hear about the use of small refinery waivers and the challenges with pathway approvals this morning. And despite some flaws, I believe it is critical, whether through RFS or another program, that the benefits of our nation's clean energy transition are shared throughout the country, including rural communities. Unfortunately, this administration's actions indicate that they do not share this belief. We have seen it through unnecessary trade disputes that hit farmers hardest. We have seen it when the President continues to deny the threat of climate change, despite the National Climate Assessment's finding that changes in precipitation, coupled with rising extreme temperatures, could reduce Midwest agricultural productivity to levels of the 1980s before mid-century. These types of actions are harming and will continue to harm rural economies and undermine the goals of the RFS. We should be working on legislation that meets our collective need for a cleaner energy future while directly benefiting and creating opportunities in rural communities. From the start of this process, I have told stakeholders that I support the RFS or its potential replacement to the extent that it results in fewer greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not certain that would be the outcome under the proposal before us, so while I look forward to hearing everyone's feedback, I do have concerns in its current form. I specifically want to mention the proposal's changes to the CAFE program in Title III of the draft. Perhaps all of today's witnesses will acknowledge the potential for high-octane fuels as a method to achieve fuel economy standards. If CAFE compliance will become easier through a high-octane performance standard on top of the administration's freeze of previously announced standards, I do not think we should also provide additional credits to achieve compliance as would occur under Title III. If we really want to drive efficiency and innovation while creating certainty, this discussion draft should drop the so-called harmonization language and include legislation written by our colleague, Ms. Matsui, to preserve the previously announced CAFE standards. Finally, I want to say perhaps the only thing that will unite today's witnesses, granted it is unity through opposition. It is my belief that the federal government should be advancing policies that reduce demand and reliance on liquid fuels. I'm not naive enough to think this will happen overnight, but we know that the transportation sector is now the greatest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and that our climate policy must address it. Earlier this year, we held a hearing that focused on electrification, but sadly, none of the ideas discussed are reflected in the 21st Century Transportation Fuels Act. If we're going to do a major overhaul of federal fuel and vehicle programs, we must look at how to further promote EVs as well. For the time being, while liquid fuels continue to be the predominant energy source in transportation, these fuels should be as clean and used as efficiently as possible. I thank you again, Mr. Chair, for your hard work on developing this proposal, and with that, yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that, and I want to thank you and Mr. Flores and others for their work on this recent release of your discussion draft on the topic of our hearing today. You have done an amazing job on this, and it is tough work. And I appreciate the seriousness that you've brought to this matter, and I'm glad you followed through on your promise to push toward a legislative solution rather than let the traditional parties on this issue comfortably sit in their foxholes in perpetuity. It is one of the reasons why this hearing today is so important. This draft did not happen overnight. We all know that. And I want to acknowledge and commend the countless hours both you and Mr. Flores and our staffs and your staffs have spent trying to figure out what makes sense for our nation's transportation fuel mix. As you've already said, Mr. Chairman, over the past 2 years, this subcommittee has held 3 roundtable discussions to educate members and another 5 hearings, today marking the 6th, to fine-tune the committee's understanding of a range of issues related to liquid fuels and the motor vehicles powered by them. Throughout this process, I've been struck by the acknowledgement that liquid fuel-powered motor vehicles are expected to be the dominant type of vehicle used by Americans for decades to come, and no one knows what's going to happen regarding our nation's renewable fuel mix beginning in 2023, which is why this draft is so important. By transitioning to higher-octane fuel blends in vehicles whose engines are designed to maximize fuel efficiency, we can both incorporate more renewable liquid fuels into the fuel supply while also increasing miles per gallon for consumers. I'm pleased the discussion draft includes provisions I strongly support, especially the one which removes the gross inequity in federal fuel policy regarding wood and forest management, so that woody biomass can play a larger role in the RFS program. But as the chairman stated, this draft is not a final product. We all know that. Getting this policy right is not easy, especially with complex and sometimes contentious issues like the Renewable Fuel Standard and Vehicle Fuel Economy Standards. Like any major legislation just starting out, it needs additional refinement. I'm interested in learning from the stakeholder expertise about what necessary refinements are needed for this bill and to hear about any important items that are not contained in it but that you believe should be. I'm also concerned about what makes sense for the interests of consumers, especially as it relates to access to and pricing for and the availability and quantity of the engines and fuels that consumers demand or that the federal legislation requires. These are issues that were tangentially discussed in our hearings, but I feel can only be appropriately honed when people are evaluating a concrete proposal and providing real feedback about the best way to accomplish these goals. So to me, the bottom line is that new fuels and vehicles must first and foremost deliver benefits to consumers while improving our environment. I know some folks will want to discuss electric vehicles in conjunction with this bill, and frankly, as a hybrid driver on both coasts, I'm certainly interested in hearing more on the subject, but liquid fuels for motor vehicles and the looming question arising in 2023 make the most sense to tackle right now. As I said at our 3rd hearing, as things stand right now, I have great concerns about the viability of EVs and meeting the needs of rural America, not to mention range and price issues that make EVs unrealistic for many Americans today, even as new innovations make their use more and more reasonable for many in our urban and suburban areas. I want to welcome our witnesses and those who chose to send the committee their comments to be included in the record. I look forward to learning from stakeholder expertise and really appreciate you all being here today. I know some interests have chosen either to be hypercritical or not to offer suggestions, but recognizing time short for addressing this issue in a timely manner, I think they do so at the peril of their members. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and Mr. Flores and others for your work, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back then on this time. The ranking member of the full committee is not able to be here, so we'll now conclude with members' opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. We want to thank our witnesses for being here today and to testify to the subcommittee. Today's witnesses will have the opportunity to give opening statements, followed by a round of questions from members. And our first witness panel is seated. I'll introduce you as you're asked to speak. And we would like to start with Mr. Steve Zimmer, Executive Director of the United States Council for Automotive Research, U.S. CAR. Sir, you're welcome, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Walden, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the committee, my name is Stephen Zimmer, Executive Director of the United States Council for Automotive Research, LLC, also known as U.S. CAR. It's a collaborative automotive technology research organization of FCA US, Ford Motor Company, and General Motors. U.S. CAR provides a legal framework for its 3 members to conduct non-competitive research, supporting a broad technical research portfolio in 8 broad areas: powertrains, electrification, electronics, batteries, hydrogen and fuel cells, manufacturing, safety, and materials. The research conducted at U.S. CAR results in a shared knowledge base that enables the development of new automotive technologies that solve industry-wide challenges and strengthens the U.S. auto industry. This approach supports multiple pathways to continually improve or evolve new automotive propulsion systems that meet current and future fuel efficiency, emissions, and safety requirements, and creates innovative and environmentally responsible solutions for customers. Each U.S. CAR member has its own independent research organization and portfolio, but at U.S. CAR, they work together. These research tasks would be impossible to achieve as quickly, if at all, as individual companies. I appreciate the committee's invitation to appear today to address the discussion draft of the 21st Century Transportation Fuels Act. As you know, personal mobility is changing at an unprecedented pace. The automobile industry has and will deliver mobility options that balance the many technical, safety, and societal requirements for the driving public. However, now more than ever, all major mobility stakeholders must better coordinate and develop integrated energy and mobility strategies together. This committee's discussion draft is a great milestone and an excellent example of such an integrated approach. Setting a national minimum octane standard is a necessary step towards the continuing development of the next generation of high-efficiency vehicles. We commend the committee and the industry stakeholders involved for their collaboration in this effort. We believe the proposed increase to 95 research octane number, or RON, as the new U.S. standard for regular gasoline for model year 2023 and beyond will be a win for consumers, the auto industry, fuel producers, agriculture, retailers, and society. U.S. CAR and its member companies are encouraged by the proposed 21st Century Transportation Fuel Act. The discussion draft provides an excellent starting point for national octane standard legislation. Higher octane rated gasoline facilities and the development of more efficient spark ignition engines. It is estimated that an increase in RON to 95 enables an average 3% improvement in fuel economy of newer vehicles. Increasing octane is beneficial for virtually all spark ignition engines, regardless of the manufacturer, engine size, or architecture, and does include both hybrid electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. While establishing a new 95 RON grade is the critical piece of this proposed approach, it doesn't preclude the availability of a higher RON octane grades for use in high-performance vehicles. In Europe, 95 RON is regular, while performance grade is 98 RON or higher. While we view the discussion draft as a significant step in the right direction, we have some concerns and questions regarding several provisions. These include the provisions relating to a waiver for fuels containing up to 20% ethanol, vehicle design requirements, and misfueling provisions. U.S. CAR and its member companies look forward to working with the committee to address our concerns and other areas of the legislation. Ultimately, we believe the discussion draft led by this committee is the only viable near-term pathway for implementation of a 95 RON minimum and the benefits it can deliver. U.S. CAR members are ready to move forward and implement this initiative. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here with you today and to provide testimony in support of this discussion draft proposing a high-octane fuel that will enable higher efficiency vehicles. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Timothy Columbus, General Counsel, Steptoe and Johnson, on behalf of the National Association of Convenience Stores and Society of Gasoline Marketers. You are recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Here we are again, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the committee, my name is Tim Columbus. I'm a law firm Steptoe and Johnson. I appear today on behalf of our clients, the National Association of Convenience Stores and the Society of Independent Gasoline Marketers of America. These associations represent something over 80% of the retail fuel sales in the United States. At the outset, it's important that you understand that neither association today has a position on the draft, the discussion draft we're talking about. We do not support it. We do not oppose it. We commend the committee and the staff who've put a lot of time into this, and we think it's an excellent start. There's still questions that you have to answer and we have to answer before we know where we'll end up on this. In my written statement, I touch on a number of issues and suggestions. I'm going to touch on only 5 of those today. Specifically, we would suggest that the draft language be modified to 1, make clear that any technological solution adopted to prevent misfueling must be cost-effective for the automakers, but also for retailers. It is important to the retailing community that we don't end up carrying the costs of implementation on this ourselves. These are mostly small businesses, and they're very cost sensitive. They will be happy to do their part, but this is going to have to be everybody doing their part. Number 2, make clear that a retailer who complies with the misfueling prevention requirements is protected from liability resulting from any consumer activity, i.e. behavior over which it has no control. Number 3, make clear that existing dispensing equipment need not be hardened to ethanol blends above E10 unless those higher blends are in fact dispensed through that pump or dispensing equipment. Require EPA and FTC to harmonize their labeling regimes, and those required labels must be clear regarding the octane and content levels being dispensed from any particular pump. That is not, they don't have to say exactly what it is, but there should be some. This would be up to E15, this could be up to E20. The fact is that the legacy fleet is not ready. I'm an old man, the chairman knows this, I drive a very old car. It's very happy on E10. It is not prepared to drink E15, and it will spit up E20. So I have to know when I take that car to fuel what I'm buying, and that's really what we're looking for here. Finally, make clear that any price posting requirements that you set forth be compatible with relevant state and local laws, and crucially, not impair a retailer's ability to communicate cost-saving offers to consumers. And let me give you the example here. Most state laws require that the highest price for anyone to come in and buy a particular commodity be posted, and we're fine with that. However, many retailers offer multiple prices at a pump. For example, if you come in and buy a car wash, you may get 8 cents a gallon off. Or if you are a member of an affinity program, you may have a bargain. The key here is to make sure that we can comply with state law, but also not interfere with retailers' ability to offer consumers via the price signs a means of saving money. With that, I'm going to wind up. I know that you're stunned. I'm not going to use all my time. Again, we don't have a position on this today. We look forward to working with all of you going forward on this project and commend you for what you've done so far. I will be happy to respond to any questions my testimony may have raised. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. The chair now recognizes Mr. Wesley Spurlock, past president and chairman of the National Corn Growers Association. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes, and welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and subcommittee members. I appreciate the opportunity to be here for the National Corn Growers Association. I'm Wesley Spurlock, and our family raises corn, cotton, and cattle in the Texas Panhandle. As producers of the primary feedstock used in ethanol, corn farmers have a strong vested interest in the future of transportation fuels. The Renewable Fuel Standard has created significant opportunity for the farmers The RFS is one of the most ambitious and successful energy, environmental, and economic policies Congress has enacted, not only for farmers and rural communities, but also for our drivers, our air quality, and our nation's energy security. As use of homegrown renewable fuels has grown and as farmers have become more productive using fewer resources, the benefit of the RFS has exceeded the congressional projected. Agriculture met the challenge to help fuel America, not by putting more land into production, but by becoming more productive with existing resources. Farmers today produce more corn with less land because of the average has increased on corn by more than 25 bushels since 2007. Ethanol production creates value-added co-products such as distillers' grain for feed, corn oil for biodiesel, and so the same corn provides food and fuel. The value added by ethanol and increased farmer productivity has had a positive impact on rural America, helping the next generation return to their family farms. But it's not only the farmers who benefit from the new renewable fuels. Renewable fuels save drivers money. Environmental advocates backed enactment of the RFS. The RFS is the only federal law that requires greenhouse gas emission reductions. Based on actual corn and ethanol production, the sustainability improvements in both today's corn ethanol results in 43% lower greenhouse gas emissions than gasoline. Clean burning ethanol is the fuel that displaces the more harmful compounds in gasoline, reducing tailpipe emissions and improving air quality. Chairman Shimkus and Congressman Flores' discussion draft includes provision corn growers do support. In addition to the RVP parity that allows higher ethanol blends and lower evaporative emissions to be sold year-round, we also support more regulatory certainty when it comes to approval of the higher blends such as E20. We support a high-octane vehicle test fuels so automakers can expedite new optimized vehicles. However, NCGA believes this discussion draft would undo successful renewable fuel policy. The net impact of this proposal would not maintain the market access renewable fuels currently have with the RFS and offer opportunity to expand ethanol as an octane source. Corn growers support high-octane fuels such as mid-level ethanol blends. We know high-octane fuels would give automakers the ability to design optimized engines with greater fuel efficiencies and with fewer greenhouse gas emissions. Ethanol is the lowest cost, lowest carbon octane source. Today's corn production practices are increasing soil carbon sequestration, and ethanol's carbon footprint is shrinking. NCGA recently submitted comments on the administration's safe vehicle rule outlining the fuel economy of emissions benefits from a high-octane, low-carbon, mid-level blend. We recommend regulatory steps that would remove barriers to fuel competition and high-octane fuel. An octane standard such as 95 RON that refiners can easily meet with current premium fuels cannot replace the market access for renewable fuels provided by the RFS. We cannot continue to reduce emissions with an octane standard that could be met by using octane from hydrocarbons. Chairman Shimkus, corn growers are grateful for your advocacy for farmers and the renewable fuels. We appreciate the time you have spent considering future transportation fuel needs. We also appreciate being asked to contribute to today's discussion. Second, the committee undertakes future legislative discussion. We ask that incoming Chairman Pallone and Tonko consider NCGA a source on renewable fuels policy and allow us to continue to work with the committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Emily Skor, Chief Executive Officer of Growth Energy. You're recognized for 5 minutes, and welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide our perspective on the discussion draft being discussed today. My name is Emily Score, and I'm the CEO of Growth Energy, the leading ethanol industry association representing 100 producer plants, more than half of the industry's total production. A transportation fuel mix with more ethanol lowers costs for consumers, revitalizes our country's rural economy, and improves our environment. Our members thank you for attending to our 21st century transportation needs and recognizing the importance of high-octane fuel in continuing to advance these national interests. We have thoroughly reviewed the discussion draft and applaud the authors for, first, recognizing that octane plays a critical role in helping automakers meet fuel economy and greenhouse gas standards. Second, allowing the year-round sale of higher ethanol blends like E15. And third, granting federal approval for fuel beyond E15, demonstrably supporting the research that affirms ethanol blends above 10% do not harm passenger vehicles. However, where we believe this draft falls short is in the assumption that the Renewable Fuel Standard, the RFS, is broken and needs to be fixed. We wholeheartedly disagree with that perspective. In fact, despite years of mismanagement, the RFS has fulfilled its congressional intent to increase domestic energy supplies, improve farm incomes, and reduce carbon emissions, with the added benefit of lowering the price at the pump. By any objective measurement, the RFS has been an overwhelming success. Repealing the RFS is unnecessary and will further destabilize a struggling farm economy and ethanol sector. Moreover, the draft does nothing to stop EPA's continued misuse of the Small Refinery Exemption Authority, or even acknowledge the agency's unprecedented and possibly illegal use of this authority. EPA has already waived up to 2.25 billion gallons of biofuel blending, undermining demand by failing to reallocate those gallons in line with congressional intent. And we face additional exemptions for 2018 and in the recently released 2019 RFS rule. We applaud the examination of an octane standard, but the draft's proposed 95 RON is easily met with today's premium gasoline, which costs consumers about 50 cents more per gallon than regular fuel. A recent report from the Energy Information Administration cites that refiners would only need to make minor operational adjustments to supply the increased octane requirement of a 95 RON baseline fuel. And in previous congressional testimony, refiners stated that they plan to meet the 95 RON fuel standard with a current 10% ethanol blend. Today, ethanol is 25 cents less per gallon than gasoline and was as much as 90 cents lower earlier this year. As I've previously testified, the past decade has shown oil companies will actively ignore economic incentives to prevent market entry of higher ethanol blends. Only by coupling a stable RFS to maintain market access with a significant boost in octane from a mid-level ethanol blend can consumers realize significant cost savings, increased engine efficiency, and substantial environmental benefits. Unfortunately, this draft as proposed will lead to reduced blending of cleaner biofuel, and it will raise fuel costs for American drivers. We commend the authors for following sound science in approving E20, but the draft provides minimal guidance on approving ethanol blends beyond E20. E15 was approved nearly a decade ago, and we are still working through hurdles erected to keep this legal fuel out of the market. This draft should recognize and seek to eliminate the myriad challenges to approving ethanol-blended fuels to enable a reasonable pathway for their entry into the marketplace. While one of the draft's primary goals is to make the U.S. fuel supply uniform, it does not unify the availability of ethanol-blended fuels above 10%. Simply preventing future actions does nothing to break down state-level hurdles that exist today. This draft may even block a state from moving forward with higher blends. We must avoid backsliding on the progress of the RFS, which has helped launch a more affordable, low-carbon alternative to traditional petroleum fuels. While we do support certain aspects of this discussion draft, we believe it misses an opportunity to lay out a bold vision for the future of affordable liquid fuels and to make a significant impact, restoring growth in America's rural communities and decarbonizing our nation's fuel supply. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Chair, thanks to the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes Mr. Jeff Cooper, President and CEO of the Renewable Fuels Association. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jeff Cooper, and I am the new president and CEO of the Renewable Fuels Association, the national trade group representing the U.S. ethanol industry. I want to thank the chairman and the members of the subcommittee for your thoughtful consideration of our nation's future energy policy needs and objectives. RFA has been an active participant throughout this process, and we have appreciated the opportunity to share our perspectives on the vital role that biofuels can play in our energy future. The draft legislation we are here to discuss today represents an important first step forward in the debate about future fuels policy, and specifically the role of high-octane fuels. Because ethanol is by far the most economical and cleanest source of octane available on the market today, it would seem on the surface that any effort to establish a high-octane fuel standard would benefit ethanol producers and the farmers who supply them. But it's not quite that simple. As currently drafted, RFA cannot support the proposal because it falls short of providing the future market certainty and the clear path to growth that our industry needs. By eliminating the renewable fuel standard requirements for conventional biofuels in 2022 and adopting a no-growth methodology for advanced biofuel requirements through 2032, the draft bill would destabilize the considerable progress our nation has made toward greater energy security, economic vitality, and environmental health. We simply cannot support eliminating the RFS program as the draft envisions without a much stronger signal to the market that ethanol's role in our fuel supply will continue to grow. Even though ethanol is far superior to other octane boosters in terms of cost and environmental performance, a 95 RON standard, when paired with elimination of the RFS, would not result in increased market opportunities for ethanol. To the contrary, we believe a 95 RON standard in the absence of the RFS or other environmental performance requirements could reduce demand for ethanol. Refiners and blenders would simply meet demand for more octane by increasing reformer severity and producing greater volumes of higher octane hydrocarbons like aromatics, which are often toxic in nature, worsen air quality, and are typically 2 times the cost of ethanol. Thus, consumers would just end up paying more for dirtier gasoline. In fact, a new EIA Commission study concludes that oil refiners would have, quote, no problem, quote, meeting a requirement to produce 95 RON gasoline beginning in 2022, and assumes that refiners would meet that standard with E10 gasoline. The study found that, quote, no significant changes in refinery configuration or throughput would be required to meet the minimum 95 RON gasoline requirement, end quote. And contrary to testimony previously offered to this subcommittee, the EIA study finds, quote, no industry-wide capital-intensive projects would be needed to meet the requirements, end quote. There are elements of the discussion draft that we do find very encouraging. We appreciate the provision requiring automakers to warrant vehicles built in 2023 and later for E20, and we welcome the requirement that EPA approve an E20 fuel waiver. However, we believe ethanol blends above E20, like E25 and E30, will be necessary to deliver the octane levels that best facilitate greater fuel economy and emissions reductions. We also very much appreciate that the discussion draft again demonstrates this subcommittee's support for addressing the antiquated RVP barrier that is currently keeping E15 out of the marketplace on a broader scale. In closing, RFA strongly believes a high-octane fuel standard can work in concert with, not in conflict with, the RFS. The measures would be complementary, and the RFS would assure that clean, renewable octane sources like ethanol are able to access a high-octane fuel market that might otherwise be closed to competition. With proper oversight and implementation, the RFS can continue to work in tandem with a high-octane fuel standard to continue to drive innovation, support rural economies, and provide cleaner fuel choices at the pump well beyond 2022. We thank you again for starting this very important conversation and look forward to its continuation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. And last but not least, on the first panel, we have Mr. Chet Thompson, President of American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes, and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Tonko, other members of the subcommittee. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning and share the views of the U.S. refining industry on this discussion draft. Let me start by thanking you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Flores, and your committee staff for the incredible work you've done over the last year on this really critical topic. No doubt the easy thing for you to have done was to run quickly away from this issue a year ago. You didn't. You chose to stick it out, and we appreciate it. We also appreciate the release of this discussion draft. Mr. Chairman, when you told us a few months ago this was coming, you promised us it would be far from perfect. You also promised us that all of us stakeholders would find something in it that we loved and something in it that we hate. Rest assured, your premonition was spot on. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're not in a position to support the draft in its current form, but we do think it moves the ball. We think it and hope it will generate momentum for further discussions and eventually statutory reform that most of the stakeholders believe is so critical. As I've testified before this subcommittee on multiple occasions, most recently last April, the RFS in its current form is unsustainable. It's bad for consumers, and it's only destined to get worse if reform does not happen before EPA takes over this program in 2022. I also testified that a proper transition from the RFS to a fuel-neutral 95 RON octane standard would be better for all stakeholders and could better harmonize our country's fuel and transportation policies. A 95 RON standard would help our auto companies improve the efficiency and reduce the emissions of the existing fleet and future fleets and comply with CAFE. It would provide retailers with optionality, to quote Mr. Columbus. It would provide farmers and ethanol producers with the potential for greater market share, contrary to what you've heard already this morning. And it would certainly provide relief from my members from the broken RFS. But most importantly, it would provide relief to consumers, relief in the form of lower prices. Against this backdrop, there are aspects of this discussion draft that we support and those that we don't. So let me start with the positive, what we can support. We certainly support the sunsetting of the RFS in exchange for a 95 RON standard, presuming and assuming it's done correctly. After years of study with the autos, a 95 RON performance standard has been demonstrated to be the most cost-effective option for consumers for improving the efficiency of the transportation fleet, at least in the near term. Indeed, there's no other fuel option that is realistic in the time frame we're talking about this morning. We support requiring all light-duty vehicles starting in 2023 to be designed specifically to run on this fuel, on a lease of a 95 octane rating and potentially higher. Finally, we support the comprehensive misfueling requirements and liability protections afforded in the draft. However, we do believe those protections need to be expanded to include the U.S. refining industry. Unfortunately, and again as highlighted much more extensively in my testimony, there are a few provisions, Mr. Chairman, as you might imagine, we can't support. So let me just highlight a few. First, we absolutely can't support a new 15 billion gallon per year mandate for conventional ethanol. Such a mandate is infeasible. Let me put this into perspective. To hit this mark by 2020, which the draft would require, ethanol blending in our country would have to increase by 700 million gallons, 700 million. Because of the blend wall, which is real, this would require E15 sales to increase by 3,000%. 3,000% in a mere 12, 13 months. This is simply not possible. Nor can we support extending the RFS program until 2032. The program must end when a new 95 RON standard takes effect in 2023. Nor can we support the draft's various E20 mandates. Autos should decide how to harden their vehicles to run on a new 95 RON fuel, not the government. And environmental and technical analysis that support sub-sim determinations, they can't be short-circuited through legislation. E20 should not be authorized to be released and used into the market until we have a full understanding of what the impact of E20 would be on existing automobiles. Finally, we do not support establishing 98 RON as a certification fuel. There's simply no nexus between a 98 RON cert fuel and the 95 RON that the draft would develop and create. There's already a pathway for EPA and for the autos to pursue to get a new cert fuel, and there's absolutely no reason that this legislation needs to address this issue. So again, in closing, let me say we appreciate your leadership over the last year, Mr. Chairman. Again, Mr. Flores and staff, we appreciate everything you've done. There are real opportunities here. The folks at this table have been at this for many years, and we believe we're really starting to advance, and there's lots of opportunities around a 95 RON standard. We hope this remains a priority for this subcommittee next year. So I look forward to answering any of your questions. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. We appreciate you all being here today. And now I recognize myself for 5 minutes to open up the round of questions for this panel. 2022 is a real date. We've asked the EPA about what could happen, and the EPA has told us that they have, quote unquote, broad authority they will have in 2023 and beyond, which could result in biofuel volumes lower than those provided in the statutory tables. Given that EIA projects a 31% decrease in motor fuel consumption between 2017 and 2025, do you expect RVOs to be higher or lower post-2022 than they are today? Mr. Zimmer, do you have any input? No. Mr. Columbus?
I'm going to take a pass on that, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Spurlock?
As the
You heard how I laid out the question.
I thank you.
2022, liquid transportation fuels are projected to decline. EPA has broad authority to reset the tables. Will they be higher or will they be lower post-2023?
I think we will show that we have done such a great job with the ethanol and where it's at as a additive in the fuel system that we will come through fine on the reset.
You say higher.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Gore?
We would anticipate that the RVOs, if the actual blending is consistent with the numbers, you'd be at 15 billion gallons of conventional corn-based ethanol.
Mr. Cooper?
Well, we certainly see no rationale for reducing the volumes post-2022, and EPA
Do you accept
is,
the premise that the EIA information that there will be less liquid transportation fuel in our market? Okay.
Yes, I agree that we are going to see a decline in gasoline consumption long-term.
You think EPA will then raise the blending limits?
Again, I think there's no rationale for going below the 15 billion for conventional biofuels.
Okay, Mr. Thompson?
There's absolutely a rationale for doing it, and if EPA follows the data, they must do it. If transportation fuel demand goes down, E15 blending by definition goes down, and the E15 market is still so nascent as not to pick up the slack. It has to go down.
Thank you. Let me go to Mr. Spurlock. First of all, I want to thank the corn growers for being very involved in this work, and I want to recognize that. In your testimony, you state that without the mandates in the RFS, refiners would immediately default to petroleum-based octane enhancers derived from their own feedstocks. Given that ethanol is such an overwhelmingly cheap octane enhancer, in addition to your noted environmental benefits, wouldn't some refiners be more competitive if they were to opt for this lower cost source of octane?
Yes, I feel that they would.
Okay, let me go to Mr. Columbus. Would your retailers like lower prices for the exact same fuel or higher prices for the exact same fuel?
Now, that I will not pass on. Retailers want lower prices. We interface with the consumer every day, and the simple reality is that the competition drives the price to the lowest plausible level, and that includes the use of feedstocks by mid-level blenders as well as refiners to generate the lowest cost of product for the consumer.
Let me go back to Mr. Edwards. I'd like for you to comment on the Mr. Cooper's quote of the EIA study on renewable fuel. Can you comment on that?
Is that for me, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman?
sir.
Oh, yes, I can. I mean, unfortunately, it's a mischaracterization of the analysis. Look, and it's consistent with what we've been saying. EIA, it was a nothing burger. They said if we look in 2023, what would there have to be substantial new investment, assuming E10, in order to make a 95 RON fuel? No, of course it wouldn't. At that point, the new fleet of autos that require 95 would just be taking off. It also assumes E10, which, contrary to what we said, assumes that the status quo remains, that the ethanol is using that baseline. Then the EIA analysis only went out to 2023, I believe, so it's 5 years of implementation. So all it says is that the U.S. refining industry, based on E10, has enough octane capacity if it wants to meet the needs. It doesn't speak to what happens when the program is fully implemented. And at that point, we think there are 19 billion gallons of octane up for grabs, and we think that that octane could be met through lots of sources, including ethanol. Ethanol has a 4-cent advantage over other sources of octane. It's inaccurate to suggest this is not potentially good market share for the ethanol industry.
Thank you. My time's expired. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to get witnesses' views on the preemption language that's included in the discussion draft. While California's low California fuel standard is not strictly an ethanol law, ethanol is certainly one potential pathway to compliance with the law. Based on your reading, do you have any thoughts as to whether Section 204 would prohibit another state from adopting a low-carbon fuel standard similar to that of California's program? Mr. Zimmer, can we start with you?
Excuse me, I don't have a comment on that specific question.
Okay. Mr. Columbus.
Okay. The fewer people defining different fuels in the United States, the more efficient the overall system is going to be. So historically, our clients have supported preemption of state fuel standards and state mandates.
And Mr. Spurlock.
I'll take a pass on that. I'm not sure what our standing would basically be on the question, and I do understand what you're asking.
Okay. Ms. Score.
We believe that the preemption language doesn't go far enough. It's looking at future actions, but it isn't looking at eliminating many of the legitimate roadblocks that exist in several states today. So what we would be looking for is to make sure that what happens at the federal level is also followed through in all 50 states.
Mr. Cooper.
We did not take a position on the preemption provisions in the draft. However, our read of it, I guess, would be that yes, future policies like a low-carbon fuel standard potentially would be preempted. But again, we did not take a position.
And Mr. Thompson?
Well, I would certainly interpret 204 to potentially prohibit other states from adopting a low-carbon fuel standard if they actually specify how much ethanol can and cannot be in a gallon of gasoline. So I would interpret it that way, and we would support that. There's a lot of resources by all the stakeholders that would go into establishing a new 95 RON standard, and a patchwork system does not work.
Okay. Do you believe this language might impact California's ability to expand or make changes to its existing program? We start with you, Mr. Thompson, and work back.
I don't think it would. It's my understanding that the draft says expressly that this doesn't impact existing prohibitions, and to the extent California has prohibitions already on the books, by definition, this provision wouldn't touch it.
And Mr. Cooper?
I would agree with that response, with the one caveat being if California did at some point in the future decide to increase the level of ethanol that's permitted in the state, this provision could potentially keep them from doing that.
And Ms. Score?
I would agree that if California wants to go further in terms of blending more renewable biofuel, it might be prohibited based on the language that we see in the discussion draft.
Mr. Spurlock?
Yes, I would agree with Emily and Jeff.
Mr. Columbus?
I think they're all right about this. So the reality is, yeah, it can get in the way of California doing stuff.
And finally, Mr. Zimmer. Okay. It's my understanding that while ethanol may be the cheapest source of octane, at the moment there's no guarantee in this discussion draft that it will be used in a future high-octane fuel. Would anyone like to comment on why or why not the source of octane should be left open? Mr. Cooper.
Well, thanks, and I'd like to use my time responding to that question to really respond to what Mr. Thompson said about the EIA report. I mean, I do think it's a very good study that underscores exactly that point, that refiners would not likely choose ethanol as the source of octane for a 95 RON fuel. You know, there's a number of refinery modeling studies out there that show refiners could get to 95 RON with just an extra 2 or 3 cents per gallon in incremental costs. They could happily pass that along to the consumer. And you know, the other thing the EIA study pointed out, and it did look longer term than just 2023. They did look further into the future and analyze whether the refining sector could meet, you know, an incrementally larger demand of high-octane fuel in the future, and it came to the same conclusion. The study also found that there is a significant amount of underutilized reforming and alkylation capacity today in the refining sector that could easily be switched on to provide that extra octane.
And Ms. Skor?
You're absolutely right. By taking away the guardrails provided by the RFS that enable market access, you're essentially closing the market from competition. The transportation fuel marketplace, it is not a free market. If it were a free market, right now the better quality, better priced octane enhancer would be in much higher demand than it is today. So a high octane standard coupled with guardrails to ensure that we're using renewable octane would be the path forward.
Thank you. And Mr. Columbus?
With respect, I disagree with Ms. Skor. I think the most important thing is that refiners are not the only source of motor fuel in the United States. People who don't own refineries manufacture motor fuel via blending of components, which are available from domestic refineries as well as foreign sources. Mr. Tonko, you and I have had this conversation before. What drives the cost of manufacture is the big stupid price sign at retail. The lowest cost wins. If a refiner wanted to forget about the lowest cost octane source in the country, I don't believe his competitors would permit that in a commercial sense. Competition actually works.
Time's expired. The chair now recognizes the Chairman Emeritus, Joe Barton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The former senator from the great state of Texas, Phil Gramm, as many of you know, had a saying, "Truth is a powerful drug. Use it sparingly." And as a retiring member, this may be my last hearing after 32 years on this committee. So I'm going to tell us what I think are some Barton truths. Now, they may not be truth, but I think they're truth. First of all, I think that Mr. Flores and Mr. Shimkus have done a very good job of trying to patch together a compromise bill that's good politics, and I think it would also work. I don't think it'd work perfectly, but I think it'd work. And I think the politics of it potentially work. But having said that, let me give you the Barton bill and just raise the hackles on everybody's hair in this room. I'd repeal every existing regulation and law on oxygens and CAFE standards. Repeal them all, except for a few. I'd maintain the oxygen requirement in the Clean Air Act. I think that makes sense. I would require that any money put into the Leaking Underground Trust Fund, which the acronym is LUST, actually be used to clean up leaking underground storage tanks. And I might, and I would listen to my corn growers on this one, I might keep the quotas on imported ethanol. I might not. But I would repeal everything else. If we did that and went to a pure market for ethanol, it would work. It would work. Back in 2005, when I was chairman, we passed the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and at the request of then Speaker Denny Hastert, we put in mandates to use ethanol or renewable fuels. We also created a lot of research programs for renewable fuels and alternative energy. And if you look at the energy markets in the United States today, solar is doing very well, wind's doing very well. Although the ethanol market's been up and down, I think you could argue that at least it's a mature market. It's not a struggling startup market. But then 2007, we came back and increased these mandates, and we also increased the fuel, the CAFE standards. And the current law, folks, is unworkable. It's not going to work. And come 2020, don't kid yourself, if we throw all this to whoever's running EPA, they don't have any magic wands over there. They're not going to be able to bring order out of chaos. So again, I want to go back to Mr. Shimkus and Mr. Flores. They have tried to look at the politics of it, I think, and they've tried to come up with something that works. Now, having said that, it's not going to, we're certainly not going to mark this bill up tomorrow and put it on the floor next week and go to the Senate and the Senate miraculously pass it. But you've got a fighting chance to do something in the next Congress. So this is a good place to start. So my question, and since this is the question period, Mr. Chairman, you've got to ask at least one question. I can't just vent here.
You haven't done that before, though. So.
Yeah, I have. So I'm going to ask Mr. Thompson. You won the lottery here. If we did what I said, pass the Barton bill, and the politics of that are terrible, so I know that's not a starter, but it is true. Would ethanol be used? Would there be a market that ethanol would compete for and be successful competing? Corn-grown ethanol from the United States.
Well, thank you for the question, and we would support the Barton bill. But absolutely, ethanol would continue to compete. The RFS could go away tomorrow, and E10 would be the dominant fuel in this country. It is the cheapest source of octane. And as you know, when you go to the pump, we're trying to put octane into the fuel, from regular grade up to premium grade. It is the cheapest source of octane. It has a 4-cent advantage over anything else. E0 is 22 cents more expensive to make than E15, and it's like 15 cents more expensive than E10. My guys are a lot of things. Wasteful of money is not one of them. The refiners own 20% of the ethanol market. Ethanol is here to stay. This notion that it won't be is it's inconsistent with reality.
Gentleman's time has.
The last thing I'll say, Mr. Chairman, I ought to be commended because the Barton bill did not bring back MTBE. And if I really wanted to be competitive, I would make it legal to.
Gentleman's time definitely has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I would want to thank Mr. Barton for his service, but also I want to say I endorsed the Barton bill with a couple of amendments. I'd also repeal all the tax credits that we have for energy, and I'd send a market signal that's technology neutral through a carbon tax. And we could, I know, so maybe the amendment, I won't get your vote in the next Congress either, I know, but I think that would be the appropriate way to push these incentives. But for the time being, I wanted to talk to Ms. Skor. We have another witness who I think is in the next panel, Brooke Coleman, who's the Executive Director of the Advanced Biofuels Business Council. Her testimony includes the following, and I'd like you to react to this because you talked about backsliding. She says, quote, "The RFS is indirectly to date a renewable octane cetane requirement. The 21st Century Transportation Fuels Act would phase out the renewability requirement and the greenhouse gas requirement contained in the RFS. And as discussed, oil companies will use more petroleum additives instead of biofuels because it's in their economic self-interest." She goes on to explain how that's backsliding. Is that the concern you expressed? And can you maybe flesh out a reaction to that?
That's absolutely our concern. If you look at the price of ethanol today, if we're talking about price competitiveness, today, wholesale, it sells 25 cents lower per gallon than gasoline. But what you see is absent a mechanism to force competition and give the ethanol producer access to the end user, the consumer, we don't have a way to compete in this marketplace. The RFS provides important guardrails, not only for market access, but for environmental impact. As Mr. Spurlock said, 43% reduction in greenhouse gas emission. That's with conventional biofuel. Advanced biofuel is up to 100%. So we're cleaning the air because we've got fewer, and it's good for not only environmental health, but human health as well.
Okay, you recognize the bind the government's in with the bill the way it is. What would be your suggestions about how to move?
I mean, you know, our overall suggestion is that you couple, we absolutely applaud seeking a high octane, low carbon national standard, but that's got to be coupled with the guardrails that we see in the renewable fuel standard that provide for market access. That would be the path forward for the most significant cost savings, the greatest fuel economy, and the greatest environmental benefit.
Right. Okay, well, again, I think we're sort of in this contortion to respond to these markets, and I think that, again, a market incentive that's technology neutral is preferable to this. Could save us a lot of time and meetings next year. But I do appreciate you taking it up. I think there's more work to do on this. I know it's not easy, and I look forward to working with you on the next Congress. And I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the last number of years, we've talked a lot about, I've heard a lot of folks talk about the greenhouse gas emissions and how we need to address it through a variety of standards, regulations, or whatever. But this is a summary from the MIT study that says if you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it's 6 to 14 times more effective if you put a gasoline tax on than worrying about efficiencies. I've never heard in 8 years anyone ever, if they're really serious on the other side, talking about reducing greenhouse gases, why they've not proposed raising a gasoline tax. So secondly, we've also talked around this table a lot about uncertainty. I'm concerned about, for example, a small refinery trying to make the change, going to spending millions to convert to the 95 or some other level of octane standards. But yet there's a movement coming from the other side of the aisle that within the next 10 years, we're going to decarbonize our transportation fuels. I don't know whether to take them seriously or not, but I see it in the media is beating the drum every day that over the next 10 years, the Green New Deal should be sweeping through Congress and should be taken very seriously. So the uncertainty is that why would a small refinery or any refinery go out and spend billions of dollars to make a change on carbon fuels when in 10 years we're going to do away with them anyway? So my question to you, to any of you, essentially is it realistic to be thinking about this Green New Deal and all the effort that's been made in crafting this legislation that it goes out the window if we're going to pass something within the next 10 years that does away with fuel? Start with you. What is it? How realistic is this? Is this just some crackpot idea?
Well, thank you. And first of all, we think going to a 95-run regulator is extremely important and very doable for the stakeholders as well as and a value proposition to the consumer. So we think it is the low-cost solution to improving the fuel efficiency of vehicles, and it's broadly applied, and it will impact.
But if we're trying to eliminate greenhouse gases, why isn't someone promoting a gasoline tax? Because it's proven time and time again that that's going to be the quickest way to eliminate greenhouse gases. But no one's doing that. So we're talking about a regulation. I want to know more about what effect we're going to see a lot of debate over the next 2 years over this Green New Deal. Is it realistic to do away with fossil fuels in transportation, as they're calling for? I'd like to hear from any one of you. I only have a minute left.
In the short term, sir, no. It's not going to happen in the short term. And I certainly commend Mr. Tonko and his colleagues for starting that conversation. There are a lot of things about EVs that have to be sorted out. There are a lot of things about EV recharging structures that have to be sorted out. I can remember many years ago, people talking about we're going to have...
Can we have the other people answer as well, just so yours is, it's not realistic? Spurlock?
As we look at the news recently, and we're talking about putting a high fuel tax on in order to improve greenhouse gas and cut the fuel down, I think if we look at what's happening in France, that's what they try to do, and
France.
That is not working very well publicly right now.
Liquid fuels will remain the dominant fuel source for many years to come, and so what is realistic is to look for ways to provide automakers with greater fuel economy, consumers with cost savings, and cleaner air. So there is an important conversation to be had and a path forward in that regard.
Thank you.
It takes roughly 17, 18 years for the fleet to turn over, right? So every new vehicle being sold today, the overwhelming majority of which are internal combustion engine liquid fuel vehicles, are going to be around on the roads driving on liquid fuel for the better part of the next 20 years. It is going to take a long time to get to the electric vehicles and some of the ideas that are contemplated in a Green New Deal. So, we think there's an immediate opportunity to help decarbonize that liquid fuel that's going to be used in that intervening period.
Yes, we firmly believe that fossil fuels in the internal combustion engine will be here for many decades to come.
Thank you. I guess one of my
Gentleman's
point
time
is that
is-
I'm worried about, Mr. Chairman, and as we close out on this, is small refineries are going to be challenged under this. I just hope there's some language, something can be worked into your bill that takes care of those small refineries, that gives them some protection as compared to the larger, the marathons and the mobiles.
We'll talk about that. The gentleman's time's expired.
back.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson.
I thank the chair. I'd like to open my questions by saying congratulations to Chairman Shimkus, not only for this bill, but this past Saturday, his Army squeaked by my Navy in a football game in Philadelphia.
I was being kind and didn't dig anything into you, so it's your mouth to God's ears, right?
I said congratulations, Fred, congratulations. Also congratulations to my Texas colleague, Bill Flores. You guys have done a lot of hard work to get this bill where it is right now, this discussion draft. It's too late for this to become law in this Congress, but the table has been set for real action in 116th Congress, and thank y'all for that. My first question is for you, Mr. Zimmer. In your testimony, you mentioned that 95 RON is a, quote, fundamental enabler, end quote, for lower emissions. As someone who represents an area that's made great emissions progress, Houston, Texas area, and is making every effort right now to reduce emissions, but are still in non-compliance, I know that vehicle emissions are critical to continuing this trend we've seen. My question is, can you talk about what sort of environmental benefits we'd see from moving to 95 RON?
Thank you for the question. We believe that 95 RON combined with engines that are designed to use it effectively, and it's that system that's very important, can achieve on average 3% fuel efficiency across the board. And it's a broad spectrum of products. Doesn't matter who the manufacturer is or the architecture, we'll see that benefit. So we think RON 95 is doable right now. It's the only thing that's really doable and deliver that type of result. It also, you'll find a lot of internal combustion engines are used in hybrids and plug-in hybrids. Those vehicles will also benefit from that efficiency improvement.
Good point, good point. Question for you, Mr. Columbus. And I want to first of all thank you. You hosted me at a Stripe store at the West Park Tollway in Texas 22 a couple weeks ago, or a couple of years ago actually. I worked the cash register. I rolled out the worst tortillas ever in American history. Terrible, terrible, terrible. And I also pumped E10 gasoline. And so most Americans have no idea at the pump what we're talking about today. They just hear the word ethanol and see it on the gas tank, but have no implications, no idea what happens to their whole vehicle system with this in the product. They know what ethanol is, but all they want is for their car to work and their fuel to be affordable prices. So I'm always concerned about issues with misfueling and how our policies can make the lives of average Americans easier. Can you talk in your open statement, you had some comments about issues with misfueling. How about more details on what you see at your stores with misfueling challenges with E15 today, and how these new challenges going forward may impact the price of the pump and also just the perception of people when they're paying for their gasoline?
Okay. With respect to E15, as you're aware, in many areas of the country, we can only sell it 8 months a year because of the ozone season. So in that sense, the product's had a very hard time catching on going forward. There are many retailers who do not have the facilities at their retail outlets to sell anything more than E10. The Environmental Protection Agency requires a retailer to be able to demonstrate on an affirmative basis that his dispensing and storage equipment is compatible with whatever's in the ground with the product. So having said that, our experience is that, very simply, consumers want the lowest cost motor fuel they can put their hands on which their cars will run. And in my comments, I said, as long as people are aware, this car is warranted up to E15, this car is warranted up to E20, whatever. As long as those levels are posted at the retail outlet, the overwhelming preponderance of consumers take, in their own self-interest, that into account and fuel properly. There are those for whom I have for no help. I cannot help people who put gasoline in a diesel engine. I cannot help people who see a big sign that says this car has to be used for something. Don't use this fuel for anything before 2001 model year and pump it into my 1987 car. If I do that, it's my fault, it's not the retailer's. But I believe that low-cost provider still wins in the retail market.
Thank you. Time to yield back.
Gentleman's time expired.
Congratulations, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
3 years in a row.
Streak. Chair now recognizes the other gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate all of you participating in this hearing today. So let me start with one question for each of you, and that is, you've got two options. One is keep status quo the way it is today, make no changes, let the regulatory agencies sort out how CAFE is going to work, how the emissions requirements are going to work, and how the RFS is going to work. So that's option A. Option B is let's come up with a statutory solution to fix this. So which do you prefer, Mr. Zimmer? Option A or option B?
B.
Mr. Columbus.
There are things in this bill that my clients support. There are things in this bill that my clients do not support. So I can't really choose today. I got to see that final product.
I understand that, but do you?
There are things in the fuel system that are broken, Mr. Flores. So if you say, is improvement possible, the answer is yes.
Okay, good. That's close enough. Mr. Spurlock.
I would agree with Mr. Columbus. There are things that can be improved and need to be improved, and look through all levels as we go that direction.
Okay. Ms. Gore.
I would say that improvements need to be made on the administration side, the implementation of the renewable fuel standard currently on the books.
Okay. Do you believe that the EPA has sufficient statutory authority to do the things that you'd like to do without litigation?
We do, and Reed vapor pressure is a very good example of something that's within EPA's ability to make
Mr.
happen.
Cooper.
I would agree that certainly there are things that could be improved with the current program, but we agree that EPA does have the administrative authority to make those fixes. In fact, they have the administrative authority to adopt an octane.
So are you and Ms. Gore saying that no statutory solution is the preferred outcome? Is that what I'm hearing from you?
If option B is the draft currently.
That's not what I asked. Okay. I mean, option B is a statutory solution going to be a better solution than relying on the uncertainty that currently exists with the law and the administrative structure?
I think it depends on what that statutory solution looks
All
like.
right, Mr. Thompson.
Yes, we support legislative reform of the RFS.
Okay. Well, every roundtable we've had, and almost in every hearing we've had, virtually every one of you has always said the statutory solution is better. And so that's the reason we need to stay engaged on this rather than trying to run to, as you heard earlier, run to our respective foxholes and not get anything done. Mr. Columbus, one of the things that has been claimed is that the consumer doesn't really control the cost of gasoline. I mean, can you address that? For instance, if the cost of gasoline, if the cost of liquid fuel is artificially raised, doesn't the consumer have a say on what the price is going to be by lowering their demand for that product?
Oh, I think the short answer to that is absolutely. First of all, I don't know how you artificially raise the motor fuel price. If we knew how to do that, I am telling you, we would have done it a long time ago. I always laugh about the price signs, but this is the most transparent commodities market on the face of the earth.
So at the end of the day, the consumer...
It drives price down every day to the lowest level, to the level the low-cost provider is prepared to sell it.
So if we're talking about increasing octane, the consumer is going to revolt if the refining industry, if the suppliers elect anything other than the lowest cost solution. Would you agree with that?
Totally.
Okay.
I promise you they will vote with their feet.
Okay, so there's no incentive for Mr. Thompson or his constituents to suddenly come up with a non-optimum solution that the consumer is going to revolt against.
I believe that's true, and more importantly, as those consumers vote with their feet, those companies' shareholders will vote with their lawyers. So, I mean, they have an obligation to maximize profit, and you don't do that by selling a high-cost product in a low-price market.
Okay, Ms. Score, I'm going to go over a few provisions of the draft legislation, and would you please answer 2 questions on each of these? Number one, the ethanol industry has asked the EPA to take administrative action on. Or number 2, which of these provisions do you anticipate the EPA can accomplish through rulemaking without legal challenge? First one is, can the EPA require all vehicles beginning in 2023 to use high-octane fuels? Have you asked the EPA to do that?
We have asked the EPA to certify and approve higher-level ethanol blends. With a specific date in mind, no, we have not done that.
And can they accomplish that without legal challenge?
Yes, we believe EPA has the ability to EPA has the ability to put in place a 95 RON national standard fuel.
I would assert that that's probably not going to be the case. That said, I have other questions for you. I will supplementally provide those to you and ask you to supplementally answer those. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this subcommittee hearing today and for working continuously to address the issues with the RFS. I know it's something that you and Mr. Flores have worked on for some time, and you've held numerous roundtables and hearings on this issue and heard from all parties involved numerous times, and I, for one, would like to see these issues finally resolved, but in ways that I and my constituents would like them to be resolved. It's no secret that I'm an avid Harley rider, and any vehicle with an engine and between 2 wheels. I'm also the co-chair of the Congressional Motorcycle Caucus and have concerns there as well. I also have the pleasure of representing the Great Lake State of Michigan, which is surrounded by most of the 20% of the world's freshwater resources and filled with boating enthusiasts all around that state and connected to other states as well. So they have obvious reasons to be concerned about fuel in their engines and motors as well. Michigan is also the birthplace of the modern auto industry and continues to be very much concerned in that area with a lot of research and development. But it's also the place that is very much given to antique and classic vehicles, one being my own. which has great concerns about continuing and not just being put on a shelf somewhere and looked at, but rather driven, used, continue to be used. And so, Mr. Zimmer, with those statements, I'd like to ask you a question and then open it up to any others who would address it, though it may be out of your purview. This question: how will this current draft legislation impact small engine manufacturers like Harley-Davidson and the boating industry, Evinrude, Mercury, et cetera, and the classic and antique vehicles as well?
I can't speak to those specific industries, but I do think, and I think our members believe that, you know, in this collaborative approach, they should come to the table in here and have those inputs, because, you know, I understand that there are different issues in those engines in those markets than we might have in the automobile industry. But just to reiterate, we believe the 95 RON is extremely important to the automakers and will enable improved fuel efficiency in a broad range of products.
Anyone else want to?
Well, let me add that, just to be clear, that under this draft legislation, the 95 RON fuel would be developed, you know, to be used with a new automobile fleet. It would either replace premium or add another grade of fuel to the mix. It would not impact our ability to deliver regular grade gasoline, hopefully, you know, E0, for boaters and motorcyclists. So we will continue to supply that very important market.
Certainly at a higher cost, but it needs to be there. Mr. Zimmer, you mentioned that misfueling devices beyond nozzle size are available. What are those, and should they be required?
It's a very, very, very important topic to the car makers, our misfueling in this area. And historically, we've addressed, when we went to unleaded, we addressed misfueling with nozzle sizes, and that's in the current proposal. This can be, I think it's quite complex, because of in the retail market. I think the retailers could talk about the multi-use pumps and stuff like that, but we think there is technology out there that might be, you know, very robust in this area, and we would encourage, you know, in-depth discussion there, and that's basically communications between the fueling pump and the vehicle, and we think that's probably something that's doable. We think it's probably a good option, and we would encourage people to look at it. We'd be very happy to work with.
Would require a lot of flexibility, and then consideration of defeat devices also.
Excuse me?
I would assume it would require a lot of flexibility, and then syncing up an understanding with defeat devices that could be part of the problem.
Yes, sir, and the draft, the discussion draft addresses that, and we would endorse that. In fact, there are a group of us who've been working on misfueling prevention for a while, and that includes the autos, retailers, the jobbers. I think there's probably a way through this. The question is cost. The equipment manufacturers have indicated to us a cost of something under $300 per pump for a multi-product dispenser that dispenses all 3 products or 4 products, whatever, through a single hose. That's it. But this is addressable, I believe, and one of the things we're holding off on is I know what Gil Barco's told us. I want to actually see it. I want to see an invoice for it. So,
thank you.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. This is certainly an important subject, something that we've talked about before. Some of you have been here before. Mr. Cooper, I haven't heard much from you, so I wanted to start with you today and ask you a question. First of all, full disclosure, I represent the entire coast of Georgia, over 100 miles of coastline. Therefore, marine engines are extremely important to us, and the impact that some of these fuels have on, the negative impact that some of them can have on marine engines are certainly of interest and certainly of concern. Biobutanol, as I understand it, it has properties that more closely align with gasoline than ethanol does, and it has much less, I'm sure, much less of a negative impact on engines. And in fact, the National Marine Manufacturers Association and the American Boat and Yacht Council did a 5-year study with the Department of Energy and found out that studied the properties of isobutanol fuels on engines. And that was very helpful for all of us. Just wanted to ask you, if biobutanol were widely available in the market, how would it fit into the current supply? How would we be able to incorporate it?
Well, thank you for the question, and I guess the first thing I would say is first of all, E10, 10% ethanol blends are approved and warranted for all off-road engines today, including outboard marine engines and motorcycles. So the fuel that is most common in the marketplace today is absolutely fine for use in outboard engines and marine applications. In terms of biobutanol, certainly we do see some promise there. We have some member companies who are either producing or very interested in producing biobutanol along with ethanol. So yeah, I mean, I think there are other molecules, other applications, other biofuels that at higher blend levels could be suitable for today's.
Are there any obstacles for the companies that want to market this? Are they having any barriers they're having to overcome?
Primarily cost today.
Is that right?
I mean, you can't, biobutanol just can't compete with ethanol and other components in terms of production costs.
How much of a difference are we talking about?
I'd have to get back to you on that, Mr.
But it is significant enough to where
it's significant enough that we're not seeing widespread adoption of biobutanol today.
Okay. Mr. Thompson, I'll go to you. As I understand it, 95 octane is the correct octane level. In fact, you mentioned in your testimony that the ideal level was 95 for maximizing the output of vehicles. How did you arrive at that? How did you arrive at the 95 octane being the maximum level?
Thank you for the question. This is a conclusion we reached with working with several stakeholders, but really with the U.S. Car and others, where we got technical expertise from the refiners and from the autos, and frankly, they worked for almost 2 years exploring a lot of things and looking at the whole system cost. If you were looking to get a 3 to 4 efficiency improvement out of the autos, what would be the cheapest way for consumers to get there? Either all the improvements from the auto side or all the improvements coming from fuel. And this is documented in my testimony before this committee in April, but we did simply a cost analysis, and what we found was that the cheapest way to get that 3 to 4% efficiency improvement came from 95 RON. The other part of this was one of the big factors was making sure whatever we selected, according to the autos, and rightfully so, the fuel had to be available on day one, and it had to be available nationwide. Anything other than 95 RON is not available nationwide. California and 9 other states, prohibit higher levels of octane.
So you couldn't go to 97 in California?
Under their predictive model, our conclusion was no.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for that. One other question, just to follow up. Does your organization have any specific numbers on how gas mileage would improve for customers across the U.S.?
Well, again, a couple of things. One, it would be a 3 to 4% improvement, efficiency improvement. That translates into gas miles. And the other thing, it's for those who, it's equivalent to putting 720,000 electric vehicles on the road year after year after year. So there's a substantial improvement, efficiency improvement by doing this.
I suspect that would be hard to sell to a consumer who just concentrates on price.
I would hope we would have a good story to tell. This would be a high efficiency fuel that helps make their cars more efficient. It keeps optionality. It allows them to choose an internal combustion engine that's more efficient over, say, electrified vehicle they may not want. I mean, I think the consumer, when they fully understand the offering, will be supportive.
Right. My time is ended, and I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Waving on to the committee, as he has in the past, Mr. Lopsek from Iowa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really do appreciate your allowing me to wave on. You've been very generous. and especially knowing that we don't necessarily agree on these issues. So I really appreciate that a lot. We don't agree on the outcome of the football game either, since I have a stepson and his wife who are Naval Academy grads. But for me, the only surprise was the margin, that it wasn't greater. But at any rate, to the panel, I do appreciate your being here. In some ways, it's deja vu all over again because many of you have been here before. Mr. Cooper, welcome. I know Bob Dineen did a great job, but you're going to do a fantastic job as well. Thank you for taking over that position. Look, folks, we know that the RFS was created to diversify America's liquid fuel market, grow our rural economy, and cut harmful emissions. And it has succeeded in those efforts. I don't think there's any question about that at all. The RFS has helped America achieve greater energy security. It's decreased our reliance on foreign oil. My Marine kids perhaps don't have to go fight wars because of that in the future, hopefully. And that has in turn protected our national security. Biofuels have lowered costs at the pump, and in Iowa and other parts of the Midwest, the RFS has clearly been an economic driver. That's indisputable, creating thousands of good-paying jobs at biofuels plants and establishing a significant market for our farmers. Very important now, especially given our trade issues that we see happening to our farmers. We need to be looking toward growth in the future instead of taking steps backwards. This has been a very tumultuous year for biofuels producers and farmers. We know that the EPA has granted waivers to 48 refiners that have cut more than 2 billion gallons of biofuels out of the market with no plan to reinstate those gallons, and that's unfortunate to say the least. This sort of action destabilizes the agricultural economy and it have implications for years to come. And again, we have to be thinking about the trade disputes too when we talk about these issues, because that just complicates it for these farmers and others in the Midwest. And instability has led to biofuels plants across the country being idled and in at least one case closed permanently. The USDA reported net farm income is down again over 12% this year, and the ag economy is suffering. And we cannot afford, I believe, to take a step in the wrong direction. And so respectfully, Mr. Chair, I do believe that this draft legislation is a step in the wrong direction for rural America and for the RFS. It was already mentioned the EIA released a study last month that a nationwide 95 RON fuel can be achieved through petroleum products. It would not guarantee the use of more biofuels. I'd like you to respond to that. You already did a little bit, maybe expand a little bit on your answer to Mr. Thompson on that. The fact of the matter is we have to be very thoughtful about this going forward. We have to make sure that whatever we do does not harm the biofuels market, I think, here in this country. I appreciate everyone's responses to the questions here, but I do want to start out with Ms. Skor by just basically answering the question, would a 95 RON standard increase or decrease the use of biofuels?
Made with a 10% ethanol blend, it would most assuredly increase the price of fuel for American drivers.
Right. And Mr. Cooper, would you like to elaborate a little bit? I don't know if you have more to say about your response to Mr. Thompson about the...
Well, I think, again, some of the key points that came out of that study for us, and it was commissioned by EIA, but it was conducted by Baker and O'Brien, which is a well-known consulting firm that does lots of work for the oil industry. So these guys know what they're talking about. And a few of the key points that really rose to the surface for us was that there wouldn't be hardly any incremental increase in the cost of producing 95 RON at the existing fleet of refineries to meet the 95 RON requirement in the first year of the program, 2023, but also longer term. It just said there wouldn't really be a need to increase ethanol blending at all to meet that requirement.
And did you want to respond to the Barton bill? Because it looked like you had some issues with that, perhaps.
Well, I mean, we supported the first Barton bill, right, the original RFS. Right. And I just, I don't remember exactly all the points that he was making, but, we certainly see the RFS as a tremendous success, both the original program, the RFS2. We see absolutely no reason to walk away from that progress. And again, we think a high-octane fuel standard can layer very well on top of the RFS, and those two programs could work in harmony.
And I do want to make sure that, we hold this administration's feet to the fire, too, on its promise to have the EPA go ahead and write rules, obviously, that allow E15 year-round. I think that's really important. I hope it wasn't just a campaign stop, if you will, on the part of the president, Council Bluffs, for a Republican congressional candidate and a Republican gubernatorial candidate. We've got to make sure that we do hold their feet to the fire on that. So thanks, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it, and have lots more questions, but I'm sure I'll have more opportunities in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentlemen, returns of time, and the chair wants to thank the panel. You did not disappoint. Well, obviously, there's much more work to do, and I gladly will turn this over, hopefully, to Mr. Tonko in the next Congress to accept the challenge of moving forward. I would just say certainty is better than uncertainty. Marrying engineering technologies of engines and fuels for the greatest efficiencies is the way to go. So I hope that that would be at least the base by which people would move forward. With that, I want to dismiss this panel and sit the second panel. Okay, folks, let's move out of the room so we can get started. We want to thank our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. As you observed, it's still a very energetic discussion, questions and answers, and we would expect no less from this panel either. Today's witnesses will have the opportunity to give opening statements followed by a round of questions from members, and I will introduce you as I call you to testify. And we would like to start with Mr. Brooke Coleman, Executive Director at Advanced Biofuels Business Council. Brooke, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Still good morning, I think. Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Brooke Coleman. I am the Executive Director of the Advanced Biofuels Business Council. We represent worldwide leaders in the effort to develop and commercialize cellulosic biofuels, ranging from cellulosic ethanol made from agricultural residues to advanced biofuels made from sustainable energy crops and municipal solid waste. Let me start by thanking the committee and staff for deliberating what we know is a tough issue, the renewable fuel standard, and more generally, the need to curb or at least bring competition to the pump with regard to fossil fuels. The RFS is a political lightning rod, not because it is flawed, but rather because it is creating competition that incumbents do not want to see and drives the growth of now the largest renewable energy sector in the country. As the RFS pertains to the industry I represent, the cellulosic biofuels industry, an underpinning of the political case against the RFS is the allegation that we have failed to deliver on the promise of cellulosic biofuels. What has actually happened over the last 10 years is our industry has gone from the technological development phase to the commercial deployment phase as promised. But in order to build plants and scale, the RFS must be enforced. And in many recent years, the RFS was not enforced at all. In other years, billions of gallons were unlawfully waived, enriching oil refiners, large and small, at the expense of rural America. This level of unpredictability pushes innovators outside of the country, and that's what has happened as we watch China, Brazil, Canada, even Romania, and other countries now beat us to the punch on cellulosic biofuels development. So what's the solution? I think it's a fair question. While we appreciate the committee's work in trying to find one, we cannot support this particular one as constructed. There are two primary pieces to successful biofuel deployment: the impetus to produce the fuel on the front end and the ability for consumers to access it on the back end. The RFS does both at the same time. It encourages production by requiring blending, and it enforces a RIN system on the back that rewards those who make investment to deliver more biofuel to the consumer. It's a very simple system. The discussion draft more explicitly requires market readiness for biofuels as it relates to vehicles, fuel dispensers, and important regulatory updates like RVP. That's a good thing. But it offers explicit market readiness at the expense of the upstream policy that would allow more biofuels to flow through updated hoses and regulations and into vehicles. Ideally, a free market provides the impetus to produce biofuels, but as we have seen for decades with ethanol, beating the incumbent on price does not guarantee demand because motor fuel markets are not free markets. Replacing the cure for this problem in the RFS with an octane standard is the equivalent of an open invitation for the oil industry to use less biofuel and increase carbon emissions in the process. Earlier this month, the EIA, on a report that we've talked about already, confirmed what the oil industry has previously admitted, that a 95 RON standard could be easily met with minimal refinery upgrades. The truth is, and we haven't talked about this, we've done this before. The oxygen standard enacted in 1990 was a so-called performance-based fuel quality standard that was supposed to drive demand for ethanol based on its superior fuel characteristics, including price. It didn't because the oil industry prefers to control the entire motor fuel gallon by purchasing octane from themselves. So instead of ethanol, we got MTBE, a fuel additive that polluted America's drinking water and had some small towns trucking drinking water into local schools. Unfortunately, the discussion draft offers a similar dynamic as it pertains to advanced biofuels. The act would establish a more automated system when it comes to setting and enforcing advanced biofuel standards. In theory, this system would provide more predictability for innovators. That is a good thing. But it offers predictability by tying the volume standard to the actual production in the prior year. The problem with setting the cellulosic biofuel standard based on prior year production is it puts the growth trajectory of cellulosic biofuels into the hands of our competitors in the oil industry. This is true because in order to secure investment to build capacity, our industry has to be able to show likelihood of demand. In the absence of a free market and with an RFS phase-out, we would have to show some sort of commitment from the oil industry to buy cellulosic biofuel. If the oil industry knows it can control the cellulosic biofuel to secure financing, if the oil industry knows it can control cellulosic biofuel development by avoiding those commitments, and that federal law now rewards that behavior with greater market control, that's what they will do. We continue to believe that the solution here is not legislative. There is already an administrative effort underway to address RVP. We can do many of the things to create certainty from a forecasting perspective inside of existing law. We appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Mr. McAdams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Flores, Ranking Member Tonko, Congressman Olson, Chairman Shimkus. I'm delighted to once again appear before you to testify on the importance of federal policy in furthering the development of next-generation sustainable renewable fuels. On behalf of the membership of the Advanced Biofuels Association, I want to personally thank Chairman Shimkus and Congressman Flores for your courage and leadership in providing an RFS draft reform package. The countless hours that members on both sides of the aisle have spent attempting to craft a middle ground to update and revise the focus of the delivery of second-generation advanced fuels is long overdue. In spite of the best intentions, it is clear that the current statute needs updating if we are to enable the technologies to move forward and produce the volume of fuels which were envisioned by the original authors of the law. That renewed focus is particularly relevant given the recent release by the administration's warning on the impacts of climate change and the containment of the most destructive wildfire in California's history. In addition, the continued growth in aviation, which is currently doubling every 15 years, along with the new global carbon targets for international airlines, will drive the need for these fuels moving forward. These advanced fuels will provide an alternative to higher carbon fuels in our future, as noted by the government's recent climate report. However, as I have testified before, there are numerous barriers to entry under the current RFS program that specifically disadvantage advanced biofuels. My written testimony goes into specific recommendations in more detail. Previously, I provided you 21 of them. But I'd like to highlight a few potential reforms as well as offer some comments on the recent draft bill introduced by Congressman Shimkus and Congressman Flores. First and foremost, you consider making changes to the RFS, we would urge Congress to take the politics out of the equation as much as possible by making the RFS a rules-based system. Therefore, we support the provisions in this bill that would base the annual RVO on the previous year's actual production, queuing up mid-year and in-year volumes, which would set the RVO for the future, and that would therefore set a mandate for the obligated parties. This would reduce volatility in the RIN market, diminish the need for cellulosic waivers for fuels which do not exist, and encourage obligated parties to buy available produced gallons for their RINs. Any reforms to the RFS should also expand the definition for what constitutes renewable biomass and allow feedstocks to comply on a mass balance basis rather than imposing burdensome mapping restrictions on those feedstocks. Naturally regenerative trees under sustainable forest management practices should be available for use under this program. Currently, they are not. We are long past due to have a planted tree pathway promised by EPA years ago. The Shimkus-Flores bill takes an important step in this direction by redefining renewable biomass to include trees and tree residues, paving the way for increased deployment of pyrolysis and other technologies. By the way, the 3 current cellulosic plants being in the United States, which we represent, are all pyrolysis technologies. We support the bill's efforts to pivot the focus on the development of fuels of the future by providing some regulatory certainty for the advanced and cellulosic biofuels and biodiesel through 2032 or longer. We'd recommend you look at the length of the average debt financing, which is 20 years, in lieu of 2032. This time frame is consistent with the standard of the debt term. The steps which you have taken in your draft bill at a minimum will send a strong signal to the financial institutions that the federal government supports the development of these fuels of the future by guaranteeing the RIN over a longer time frame. We also suggest you encourage EPA to address the biointermediate issue in the upcoming reset rules proposed this year. Currently, 3 of our members who are building plants would not get a RIN unless this problem is resolved. I have attached a list of other specific recommendations for your consideration, which I believe would all fall under the title of common sense, which will require statutory and changes in order to allow EPA to make this program more economically and administratively efficient. Again, on behalf of all of our members, we want to thank you for your leadership and urge the members of this committee to seriously consider making the reform of this program a priority in the coming year. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. McAdams. I think we can all agree on having common sense titles in our bills. I think that's a good start. Ms. Bracci, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate having the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas. Renewable natural gas, or RNG, is derived from biogas captured from organic waste streams at landfills, wastewater treatment facilities, and from anaerobic digestion of agricultural waste. The captured biogas is refined to meet fuel quality standards that make RNG indistinguishable from natural gas. The fuel is fully fungible in our nation's existing infrastructure and can be readily used in natural gas vehicles. More than 25% of the nation's medium and heavy-duty natural gas vehicles are fueled by RNG. RNG qualifies as a cellulosic biofuel under the Renewable Fuel Standard. It reduces life cycle greenhouse gas emissions by 80% or more compared to conventional diesel fuel. In fact, the RNG industry provides more than 95% of the fuel used to meet the program's cellulosic biofuel requirements today. The production and use of RNG has grown significantly since it was included in 2014 as a cellulosic biofuel. The industry has developed over 45 production facilities, and there are over 50 projects currently under construction or consideration. RNG production for transportation fuel grew from approximately 33 million ethanol equivalent gallons in 2014 to 240 million gallons in 2017. That's more than a 620% increase in the 3-year period. This growth has put the industry on track to exceed EPA's production estimate from 2018. Each RNG project creates 173 direct or indirect jobs and attracts between $10 million and $70 million in capital investment. In sum, the RFS has resulted in a growing, vibrant domestic RNG industry that is converting waste into growing volumes of domestically produced cellulosic biofuel that is good for the environment. And that sounds like a win-win policy to us. As I mentioned earlier, the RNG Coalition is pleased to provide initial feedback on the discussion draft. The RFS is a complicated, multifaceted program, and statutory changes should be carefully vetted given the impact they can have on stakeholders who've made significant capital investments. The RNG Coalition recognizes the subcommittee's diligence in looking at this issue. The RNG industry supports the RFS program as a way to increase domestic production and use of advanced biofuels and, in turn, address the nation's energy and environmental policy objectives. This methodology used to set volume obligations under the RFS program should be consistent with this approach. Volume targets going forward should be realistic and attainable. They should also be structured in a way to encourage steady growth of advanced biofuel production. Under current law, the RFS program does not lapse. Beyond 2022, the EPA administrator sets the program's volumes based on 6 statutory factors. The discussion draft would sunset the RFS program for advanced biofuels after 2032. RNG projects require significant capital investment and deployment in new infrastructure. They often involve a 20-year offtake agreement with feedstock providers. A long-term RFS program provides a policy framework that attracts the capital needed to develop new RNG projects. Conversely, a premature sunset of the RFS program's advanced biofuels requirements could chill investment in new RNG projects, which could undermine the overall policy objectives of the RFS program. The discussion draft would also modify how the volume targets for advanced biofuels are set. It would use the previous year's production data to set annual use requirements for advanced biofuels. While the RNG Coalition recognizes the desire to provide certainty in the volume setting process, this approach could have the unintended consequence of causing advanced biofuel production to stagnate or potentially contract. The RNG Coalition wants the RFS program structured in a way that promotes steady, sustainable growth in the advanced biofuels marketplace. Mr. Chairman, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, again, I appreciate the opportunity to testify. The RNG Coalition recognizes the hard work and effort that this subcommittee has made to tackle what is admittedly a very, very difficult issue. There are significant benefits associated with the expanded domestic production and use of RNG, and we remain willing to work constructively with you going forward to achieve the RFS program's worthwhile policy goals. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Fialkoff, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening comments.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, thank you very much for inviting me to testify today. It's really a privilege to be here with you. My name is David Fialkov. I am the VP of Government Relations at NATSO, which is a national trade association representing really off-highway fuel retailers, from large multi-billion-dollar travel center and truck stop chains to smaller independent single-store mom-and-pop type operators. Most of our members sell gasoline. Many of them blend ethanol. My testimony this morning, however, will focus primarily on diesel markets and opportunities for Congress to incentivize diesel retailers to incorporate increasing amounts of advanced biofuels, such as biodiesel, into the nation's diesel fuel supply. The RFS, which this bill would reform, has largely been successful in doing this. Over the last decade, for example, biodiesel has grown tremendously. And the reason for that is that the RFS creates a mechanism whereby diesel retailers can offer fuel to truck drivers for less money the more biodiesel that they incorporate into their fuel supply. And that's really a fundamental component to understand throughout all of this. Retailers are not obligated to blend biofuels under the RFS. They choose to do it. And they only choose to do it if doing so allows them to sell fuel for less money. So in this respect, retailers really function as a surrogate for consumers in assessing advanced biofuels value proposition. And my views on the legislation today, which I will share, are simply designed to help you enhance advanced biofuels value proposition. In many ways, the bill moves the RFS in the right direction in this respect. In other areas, it could be improved. Taking a step back, the RFS is really an extraordinary example of Congress and the executive branch sharing authority to implement a program. Mandating such a substantial shift in the composition of motor fuel in the United States is not an insignificant assertion of legislative authority. And obviously, to avoid unintended consequences associated with future market developments that Congress cannot be expected to predict or know, EPA has to have some flexibility to make adjustments along the way. In my view, at this time, however, EPA has too much discretion, and it has led to volatility and uncertainty that undermines the program's objectives. In reforming the RFS, the main lesson that you should have learned over the last decade is that Congress needs to reassert itself and limit the degree to which the ideological and political preferences of the executive branch can alter the program's trajectory. Overall, I think that the bill threads this needle quite nicely. A rules-based RVO process, extending the advanced biofuels categories an extra 10 years while also allowing for mid-year adjustments, will undoubtedly incentivize more fuel retailers to buy and blend more advanced biofuels, while baking in enough flexibility with the mid-year adjustments to avoid the unintended consequences. That being said, it was very disappointing to see that the bill was silent on the issue of small refinery exemptions. Over the past year, the EPA has been handing out small refinery exemptions like Halloween candy, and they have been doing it oftentimes to some of the most successful, profitable refining companies in the country. And the fact that those agencies are doing that in this way is undermining the demand for advanced biofuels. That agency officials can say with a straight face that they're doing it consistent with the law should operate as a bright, shiny red flag to you that it's time to re-examine that provision, either by eliminating it entirely or by altering it so that waivers are issued far less frequently and they are issued in a way that does not so dramatically undercut demand for advanced biofuels. I've heard Chairman Shimkus say before that in giving advice to people who testify that you're not going to hurt anyone's feelings if you don't use your full allotted 5 minutes. So in that vein, I hope to hurt none of your feelings, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Kovarik. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Kurt Kovarik, and I'm Vice President of Federal Affairs for the National Biodiesel Board. My trade association represents 130 members with biodiesel production facilities in nearly all 50 states. They produce clean-burning biodiesel from a variety of feedstocks, including vegetable oils, animal fats, and recycled oils such as used cooking oil. I appreciate the subcommittee's inclusion of biodiesel in today's discussion and throughout this process. We look forward to contributing to the development of any proposals to improve the renewable fuel standard. The discussion draft highlights one of our frustrations with the RFS. The biodiesel industry has proven over and over again its ability to produce higher volumes, yet EPA continually sets biomass-based diesel volumes in the annual RFS rules well below our demonstrated capacity. The agency continues, as demonstrated in November's final rule, to limit growth for our advanced biofuel volumes. Biodiesel achieves considerable carbon reductions, up to 86% compared to petroleum fuels. Higher volumes for biomass-based diesel would better achieve the environmental goals of the original RFS program. Biodiesel is the success story of the RFS. The program has been the foundation for biodiesel industry's growth over the past decade. Our industry has grown from about 400 million gallons in 2007 at the start of the program to more than 2.6 billion gallons today. We expect the program will continue incentivizing investment and supporting our industry's growth over the decade and more. We're pleased that the discussion draft recognizes that the biodiesel industry would not benefit from the proposed changes to the octane standard or other regulatory changes in the discussion draft. We appreciate the committee's recognition that the biodiesel market is different from the ethanol market and that the discussion draft includes provisions to provide additional certainty for advanced biofuels. Unfortunately, these provisions fall short. We are concerned that the discussion draft does not incentivize ongoing investments and support predictable year-over-year growth for our industry. The discussion draft would direct EPA to set backward-looking volume requirements. While this may protect existing assets in the near term, it would not drive further investments or growth. One necessary improvement to the draft would be to add achievable, predictable growth for our industry over time. With consistent and predictable growth, the biodiesel industry would have the necessary incentive to make capital investments, develop additional feedstocks, and improve efficiencies. Stagnant or decreasing volumes do not provide any of those incentives. For the biodiesel industry, there is no pressing need to significantly reform or replace the RFS. The program does not end or change drastically in 2022, despite what some have said. The EPA is required to set future volumes for all fuel categories under the same process that has been in place for biomass-based diesel since 2013. The RFS, therefore, has the potential to support our industry's growth beyond 2032, where the discussion draft's support would end. The biodiesel industry continues to grow and to invest under the current RFS because the program, when stable, promises the opportunity for additional growth. We appreciate that the discussion draft would direct EPA to set volumes according to our proven ability to produce, but the draft would be significantly improved if it provided long-term certainty and predictable growth over time. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. Today, on behalf of America's biodiesel renewable diesel industry, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your opening comments. We appreciate each of your testimony. We're now going to move into the Q&A portion of our hearing. I want to recognize myself 5 minutes for my questions. Mr. Coleman, your testimony claims that the discussion draft will increase gasoline prices because ethanol will not be used by refiners. That's somewhat in conflict with what we heard in the last panel. I think there are some folks that want to argue about the readily available octane enhancers today versus what was available 15 years ago, but I'm interested in developing a current solution. So what's your proposed legislative solution for keeping gasoline prices lower using a high octane performance standard?
So the reason that I made that allegation is that there is no alternative octane to ethanol that is even close to as cheap as ethanol is. And so you either creating a status quo environment or are you putting something in the fuel that is more expensive? You don't have to look very far. If you look at 0% ethanol blends in the market today, they're 40 to 50 cents per gallon more expensive. In terms of, and I'm not going to dodge your question on what the legislative proposal is, I think the RFS should be bedrock baseline in this country because it's produced such outstanding outcomes, particularly for the middle of the country. And if you want to get to a cleaner environment give the auto industry what they want, which is cleaner fuel so they can improve emissions, then you do it on top of the RFS. Can you make tweaks to the RFS that make sense? Sure. Dumping the RFS for higher octane will just remove the incentive to use renewability.
So how do you set those levels in a declining liquid fuels market? How do you set them where you get them right and you don't somehow create disturbances in the market that harm consumers?
I'm not sure if I agree with the idea that it harms consumers. So if you maintain certainty with the RFS, then what the signal that sends to the marketplace is that we're going to keep ethanol in the fuel, which right now is not, Mr. Thompson said it was 4 cents cheaper, it's closer to 20 cents cheaper. It says don't replace ethanol with more expensive octane enhancers and then ramp your run the way you want to go. You don't lose ethanol, and if the oil industry wants to alkylate fuel or add more aromatics on top of that, then they can get there. They're not going to tell you they can do that, but they can do that.
Let's continue. I think we heard in the last panel that the consumers ultimately going to make the decision as far as what the costs are, not the refiners, not any other party. Mr. Kovarik, your testimony states, we appreciate that the 21st Century Fuels Act would direct the EPA to set volumes according to our proven capacity to produce. You went on to say you would prefer that it provided long-term certainty and predictable growth over time. What does that mean from a legislative language perspective? If we wanted to incorporate your concepts into our legislation, what would that look like?
Thank you for the question. I appreciate the opportunity to answer that. One of the things that has harmed our industry and really prohibited our industry from achieving its full potential is the fact that all of our federal policies that affect our industry have been terribly uncertain since the creation of the RFS, the original RFS in 2005. One way to improve this legislation might be to not only provide a longer-term period for advanced biofuels, but also include some degree of statutory certainty that volumes will increase year over year to allow the industry to make the capital investments, develop an additional feedstocks, and grow to an economy of scale where they may no longer need certain areas of federal policy support.
So let's drill in the weeds a little bit. How would you set those volumes? How would that be done when you don't know what the market's going to be like? You don't know what the capacity to produce is going to be like. You don't know where the technology is going. How would you set the volumes?
I think you could start by looking at the domestic, the market, what is currently produced, and then include reasonable, achievable levels of growth, whether that be 5% year over year might be an example, but what would be achievable and certain for the industry so that they could respond to it.
Okay. If you have positive tax treatment for biodiesel blending, if you assume that that's assured, would you need the RFS to compete?
The two policies are very complementary. The RFS essentially guarantees to producers that there will be a market for a certain volume of product. The tax incentive works in a very different way in that it provides the incentive for our downstream partners to put in the infrastructure, the blending facilities, and the retail facilities to sell additional product to consumers. The reason our downstream partners want to sell more of the product is because of the value proposition, because of a combination of the RFS and the tax credit. And I would like to see a time and place where we no longer need those policies, but the fact of the matter is neither have been certain enough with the longevity required to provide the industry with the certainty to grow and flourish.
Thank you. My time's expired. I recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think many members support the RFS due to its envisioned role in promoting the development of and market for advanced biofuels. Even the program's most ardent supporters would have to admit that the expected growth of these fuels has not come to fruition. I know there are many reasons that that is the case, but I want to use this time to look forward. So would anyone like to comment on why or why not this discussion draft would remedy those issues and actually result in the growth of a domestic advanced biofuels industry? Anyone? Mr. Coleman.
I'm sure I'll have a couple of people that want to help answer this question, but we do not believe that it's going to create growth in the advanced biofuels industry because we have to partner with the oil industry one way or the other to get the job done in the advanced biofuels industry. Sometimes it's on the front end with actual strategic investment. Valero, BP, they've been investors historically in this industry, but inevitably it's also on the back end. You have to be able to show investors that an oil industry is interested in off-taking your fuel in order to build that plant. And if we have a system that automatically predicts incoming gallons based on last year's volumes, the oil industry is simply not going to participate in that process, and you're going to have incremental, if any, growth basically only when the oil industry is completely uninvolved. And the issue that we have had with deployment over the last 10 years, I think this is a point of agreement for all of the advanced biofuels advocacy, is not one of commercial technological development. We're there. It's an issue of scale. And when the program is not enforced for 2 or 3 years in the wake of a 100-year recession, and then we have waivers, we have nothing to look to. So that is where our issues are, and we would ask that we keep pushing on EPA to enforce good law.
Anyone else? Mr.
I would say that the right question is, since you guys are working with a discussion draft here, what can you do to bring those fuels, right? And what I gave you after the last hearing was 21 examples of specific barriers to entry, of definitions and other regulatory regimes that block the future of advanced undesignated fuels and block cellulosic fuels. What this draft does do is it speaks specifically to the wood piece in a way that has never been addressed before, and that is a very positive thing. Let me give you an example. If you, under the current biointermediate regs at EPA, if I am trying to take a pyrolysis plant, which I'm either Ensign, which is building a plant in Georgia, or I'm Fulcrum, I'm building a plant in Nevada, or I'm Red Rock, I'm building a plant in Oregon, and I use a woody biomass, and I make a pyrolysis oil, under the current biointermediate standard, I can't co-locate that to co-process into a jet fuel. are into a diesel. And one of the things this hearing's done is it's focused way too much on gasoline and not enough on the fact that we use 55 billion gallons of diesel, and it's the fastest growing commodity in terms of demand going forward, along with jet fuel. So if you want to make billions of gallons of jet fuel to fly the airplanes, because they're not likely to be electric in my lifetime, you're going to need those diesel distillate fuels. And all of these impediments are statutorily driven that need to be addressed in a way. Same thing with waste oil. Same thing with one-cell biological organisms. There's a whole plethora of these things that just prohibit technologies that we never knew existed when we did this bill in '07 that block the entry to these volumes.
Thank you. Mr. Faraci.
Thanks, Mr. Tonko. So, and I think it's a great question, and I want to share the experience that we've had in the RNG industry, because it's a fairly new experience, but I think that there's some lessons to be taken from that. So our fuel became qualified as a cellulosic biofuel in 2014, and as I said in my statement, I mean, we've seen a 620% growth in the use of the fuel as a cellulosic biofuel. And one of the big things that has spurred that is the RFS program, and it's something at the federal, a decision at the federal level that we're going to prioritize the introduction of advanced biofuels and that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's a federal priority from an energy policy standpoint and from an environmental standpoint. But beyond that, what the way that the RFS is structured now is when you set volumes out into the future, it's prospective, so that it allows investors to go and get private sector capital investment to put in the projects. And like I said, when you're doing an RNG project, you know, it's not something you just put up overnight. I mean, you're going to have to go into a 20-year offtake agreement with a feedstock provider to do this. So, you know, as it comes back to the discussion of the discussion draft, I mean, I think that a piece of constructive criticism would be that you really want to have a formula going forward that does drive growth, and you want it prospective looking, because if you just look back at previous production, it could have what I was careful to say is that I think an unintended consequence of potentially having production be flat or even contract.
Mr. Chairman, could I address this RVO production question?
Well, I think I'm going to be asking you that question, so.
And I had a question for Mr. Fialkov. I'll yield back.
This is our last time together, so we're milking it out. So, so let me just go directly to Mr. McAdams, because I want to address this issue about how you set the RVOs. Obviously, you're in the minority at the panel, saying that we should do it based upon, and we've had this discussion about what are we actually producing now, and then you propose a midterm review. So, talk to your federal panelists and why you think that is successfully achieving, I think, what their goals are.
Okay, so first of all, we need to realize that the federal court directed EPA in 2013 that they could not put their thumb on the scale. So all three of these guys up on this panel are suggesting that they want to play politics and put their thumb on the scale instead of having a rules-based rule. I disagree with them. So in the case of Mr. Kevorek, if you took the approach that you have put in this bill, Mr. Kevorek would have gotten 2.7 billion gallons of an RVO for the biodiesel industry this year instead of 2.1. That's a 600 million gallon advantage. So I don't know what we're talking about when we're talking about taking the actual production.
Okay, we can be nice.
Okay, taking the actual EMTS numbers off the system, which have to be put in the system 5 days after the fuels are produced, and then every 6 months queue up the RVO in line with the actual production of those numbers. Okay? Now, the second reason we should do this is because the oil industry and the obligated parties were allowed to use the waiver credits under the cellulosic standard, and EPA, under the existing statute, which is another reason why we have to change the statute, EPA has taken the position since the beginning of the program that they must issue the same number of waiver credits each year as the RVO. So if I'm ExxonMobil, hypothetically, and I only need 300 million waiver credits for the cellulosic pool, I wait until the end of the year and I buy the waiver credits from EPA, and all the gallons of cellulosic or biogas from my friend here don't get bought, and it's not bought on a ratable take. You should consider a ratable take. That's also in my written testimony.
follow up with the midterm review, and because I do think the intent was for us, let's have achievable real numbers. But then I do also appreciate the signals that we sent about for people who want a growth. So talk about the midterm review, and does that help incentivize that?
So the way I would see it is if you're actually bringing these fuels into the market, what would happen at the 6-month review, the EMT system would already incorporate these advanced numbers, so the number would go up. So for Manny, at the 6-month mark, instead of having to wait until the end of the year and argue that the next RVO should go into a black box at EPA and the number be lifted, the number automatically at 6 months relative to the projects he brought in would come into the RVO. It would be added to the RVO at 6 months. It would also be queued up at the end of the year at 12 months. So you would collect your numbers, and again, the NBB guys would collect their numbers in the actual alignment with what they produced. And that has nothing to do with whether the oil industry is going to buy this fuel or not, because David's right, this fuel's going to get bought if the price is right.
Okay, let me give a short chance to respond, Mr. Coleman.
Very quickly, 2 quick things. We're not opposed to truing up. We've been asking for true up, which is midterm review for quite some time. So that's point one. Point two is
so that's a good process of our bill.
Yes, that's a good.
Very good.
Truing up is okay.
Ooh, I'm glad we got a good one.
Well, there's a comma.
Okay, keep going quickly.
No, as long as, and this is the short second point, that it's forward-looking. And EPA, the one thing that Mr. McAdams said that wasn't true is we're not asking for a thumb on the scale. After they lost that case, EPA went out and did a good forecasting methodology that's forward-looking. They can do that, have it be completely legal, and do midterm review.
Great, thanks. Anyone else? Go ahead, Ms. Fracci.
Yeah, and
quickly.
I'm going to start, Mr. Shimkus, by I'm going to be nice. So here's my here's what I would say, and I really do think that Mike is probably coming at this from a good place, and he's advocating for his members. When we say that there could be potentially be an unintended consequence, let's take a very real world example. So the EPA just came out with the RVO for cellulosic biofuels this year. They're going to set that at 418 million gallons. So prospectively for this year going forward, that's what the biofuel requirement's going to be. If you were doing a look back, it would be, the numbers aren't in final, but it would be around 323 million based on EPA's numbers. So when you're talking about something of the scale that way, when you're talking about trying to drive RNG investment, it's a lot easier to go and get that investment forward looking, having a volume like that, as opposed to looking back and saying, yeah, there's going to be this midterm review process and it may work out, it may not. People may time their buying different based on that midterm review. So again, it's just a constructive observation in terms of things to think about when you.
Yeah, I've got, my time is expiring, and so I think we're hashing this out that there is a way to get there, and that's, again, Mr. Tonko's problem next year. But I want to end on this statement, then I'll go to Mr. Olson. Is while the RFS does not end in 2022, as you all have highlighted in this panel, it does evolve in a scenario where EPA has enormous discretion to set levels based upon a bunch of unweighted factors. That should scare everyone, and that's part of the reason why we're trying to move to certainty versus uncertainty. And with that, I'd like to yield to the Texan, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and welcome, guys, and let's be very friendly. Okay, I'm from a big oil and gas state, Texas. Y'all know that, but I want to say, Ms. Fracci, I've seen your product firsthand. Back home, Fort Bend County, right near Needville, Texas, we have a renewable natural gas facility that's going strong for about 5 years now. It's a partnership with WCA, Morrow, Enerdine, and Fort Bend County. What it does is there's a municipal dump. They stack up the products at the dump, they're decomposing, they grab methane, they turn that into natural gas, get a pipeline, it goes to market. So I believe in your product, it's working back home, I've seen it firsthand, I invite you to come out and see it if you haven't. I have a question for all 5 of you, just sort of around the table. One thing that has bothered me over and over, it's talked about by this panel, is how uncertain the RFS is. I know DC has a role in that, there's other market factors, so can you talk about whether this bill moves in the right direction or the wrong direction for certainty? And are things we should look at? Mr. Coleman, you're up first, sir.
So our position on the fundamentals of the bill, which is octane trade for RFS, is that that's not going to work for us. Because we don't know what the oil industry is going to do, the EIA suggestion that they can do it without us, we do not feel like that is a good trade for us and could actually we could be rolling back from a renewable fuels perspective.
Mr. McAdams, sir.
Any bill that starts a discussion on reform is a good bill for us.
There we go. Mr. Fracci.
I would base it on current law. So right now, admittedly, there is instability in the way that it functions post-2022, but it is permanent law, and it's something that's there for our industry as opposed to something that would sunset.
I apologize, Mr. Fialkov, is that close?
That's very close.
Thank you.
It's Fialkov. But I think that the bill it moves in the right direction with respect to the rules-based RVO. I agree with everything that Mr. McAdams just said. I would say that this notion that there's kind of a homogeneous oil industry that will, as part of a stratagem, not buy biofuels in order to artificially lower the RVO in a given year is simply not true. I mean, to the extent it would lower diesel prices by a cent a gallon, I know people who would kill one another to get that cent. So that is something I'm not concerned about, and I don't know where that fear comes from. But I will say that all of the progress in terms of establishing certainty and whatnot doesn't mean a lot if you don't address the small refinery exemption issue, because that is the kind of thing that will inject uncertainty, and the mere fact that it's looming out there means that there's a level of uncertainty that you just can't overcome no matter how you adjust the RVO process.
Mr. Kovrek, your concerns.
Yes, thank you, sir. Just very quickly, I think we view the backward-looking setting of volumes as a small step towards certainty, but that coupled with no guarantee or no ensure of growth for our industry, along with the sunsetting of the program in 2032 are the failings of the bill.
Thank you. One final question for my good friend who controls all the power pumps there. You have professional drivers, mostly truck drivers, pros. We talked last panel about misfueling. Now that can be a concern. And one of the last panel pointed out a great point that, hey, I can't control a person putting diesel into a gasoline engine. That just happens. So my question is, are your customers more likely or less likely to make a misfueling mistake because they're pros? And how can this bill help sure we have no misfueling issues or as few as possible? Because that's a real big deal back home. Yes, sir.
So with respect to if I understand your question correctly, there's very little concern that a professional truck driver will put gasoline in a truck, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, but how about your client, most of the people you work for? It's not just truck drivers. You got a lot of people, you're at the pump, and that's where these mistakes are made.
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly, when you have a bifurcated fuels market or automobile market where some cars can only accept certain fuels, other cars can only accept other fuels, and one of those fuels is materially less expensive than another, there are going to be instances where people are going to try to put the less expensive fuel in a car that can't handle it. So I think that all of the misfueling mitigation concerns that were addressed in the last panel by Mr. Columbus are spot on, and the committee would be wise to take them.
And thank you for my time. Have a great holiday season. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Seeing no further members wishing to ask questions, I'd like to thank you all for being here. I think it was a very vibrant and important part of this discussion on the draft bill, and I'd like to thank you for being here today. Before we conclude, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to submit the following documents for the record: a letter from the American Petroleum Institute, a letter from the Illinois Corn Growers, a letter from Briggs & Stratton, a letter from the National Farmers Union, and a letter from the Union of Concerned Scientists. Without objection, so ordered. In pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record. I ask that witnesses submit their responses within 10 business days upon receipt of the questions. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.